Building on the past two lessons, we've talked about integers, negative numbers and their opposite positive numbers. We talked about rational numbers as far as numbers that can be put in a fraction, a ratio. Today we're going to build on that in lesson 2.3 and talk about the addition of rational numbers. How do we add them? So I tried to put a little practical example in here first to tell you why you need to know how to do this. So suppose you have a business, and in your business, on Monday you make an $18 profit. But come Tuesday, something happens and you lose $7. On Wednesday, you also have kind of a rough day and you lose $5. On Thursday, perks back up again. You have an $11 profit on Thursday. But on Friday, you lose $2. You need to be able to add all of these positives and these negatives together to figure out what your total profit hopefully is or your total loss is. When I did this one, I got a $15 profit. So I'm going to show you how to do this first using the number line, and I'm going to give you a shortcut on how to do it. When you're adding two positive numbers, just like you learned a long time ago, let's say we start with 2, and we're going to move 5 units up to the right. 2 plus 5 is 7. Let's say we start with 3 here. We're going to have a loss. We're going to add a loss to that of 5. That negative means a loss. So you're going to move 5 units to the left on the number line, and you're going to end up at -2. If you need to pause the video, do that so you can write these down. Let's say you start at a loss one day, -4. And you're adding another loss to that. You've lost 3 more. You're going to add a -3. So you're going to move 3 more units down the number line. You'll end up on a -7. Say you start at -4, but this day you earn 9. So you have a +9. And if you move 9 units to the right, you're going to end up on a +5. Do the same thing with fractions. Let's say you start at a +2/3, but you lost 4/3. So you're going to add a -4/3 to that. So you're going to have to move a -4/3 units to the left. That will give you and make you land on -2/3. All right, I'm going to show you how to do this without having to use a number line every time. It's okay to think like that, but there's a shorter way. So let's say you're going to add 2 positive numbers or 2 negative numbers. You need to write these rules down. When you do that, you're going to add the absolute values. We talked about that a couple of lessons ago. The number of units that digit is from 0. When you do that, the sum has the same sign as the add-ins. So this one's easy because we've done this for forever. 3 plus 4 equals 7. Absolute value of 3 is 3. Absolute value is 4. So we get 7. But what if they're negative numbers? Well, add the absolute values. The absolute value of -4 is 4. The absolute value of -2 is 2. When you add 4 and 2, you get 6. But the sum, the answer, has to have the same sign as these, which is negative. And I showed you that up on the number line when we did this example right here. -4 plus a -3. We had a -7. All right, so let's move on down. What if you're adding a positive number and a negative number? You have one of each. This time you're going to subtract the absolute values, and the sum is going to have the same sign as the add-in with the greater absolute value. So what if I said 5 plus -2? Well, we need to subtract them, okay? 5 take away 2, because we're subtracting the absolute values. Absolute value of negative 2 is 2. So 5 take away 2 is 3. But the 5 has a greater value than negative 2. So the answer is going to have that greater value of the positive. Over here, negative 6 plus 4. Subtract the absolute value. So the absolute value of negative 6 is 6. 4 we know is 4. So 6 take away 4 is 2. But the answer, the sum, has to have the sign of the greater absolute value, which is negative. 6 is bigger than 4. So that's why the answer has negative. And if that confuses you, draw it on the number line. Start at negative 6 and add 4 to it, and you'll get to negative 2. But these are the shortcuts of how you do it without having to use the number line. Last thing we're going to talk about second to last thing, the additive inverse. Inverse is kind of like the opposite. Two rational numbers whose sum is 0 are called additive inverses of each other. They're opposites of each other. And the properties of those, that just means mathematically speaking, what do they do? For each rational number A, so any number that you have that's rational, there is one and only one rational number that's the opposite of A, or negative A, such that when you add whatever this number is to the opposite of it, you're going to get 0. So I put 2 examples down here for you. One of a regular whole number and its integer, and one of rational fractions. So 34 plus its opposite, which is its additive inverse, is going to give you 0. Negative 5/4 plus its opposite is going to give you 0. So if you do this on the number line, if you started at 34 on the number line and you had to go backwards 34 times, you're going to end up at 0. Same with this one. If you started at negative 5/4 and you went forwards 5/4, you're going to end up at 0. That's the properties of additive inverses, the opposites. The last thing we're going to talk about is the inverse of an inverse. Now this can get kind of confusing. It's kind of like saying the opposite of the opposite. We have to think of it that way. The inverse of a rational number is the number itself. So it's like you're taking the opposite of a number. And when you do that, you're going to get the number. So let's just talk this through. And if it confuses you, don't worry. We'll go over some examples tomorrow. Let's pretend we've got a number x and it equals 16. Well, then the opposite of that number is negative 16. Well, the opposite of the opposite, which is the inverse of the inverse, we're going to do the opposite of 16. So the opposite of 16 has to be 16, because we said the opposite was 16. Well, the opposite of that is, we said the opposite was negative 16, so the opposite of that is 16. It's a little more confusing when you start with a negative. Here, our number is going to be negative 3. So if the opposite of x is the opposite of negative 3, that's going to be 3. Well, what is the opposite of the opposite? Here we go. This is the confusing part. The opposite of the opposite of x. Well, x is negative 3, right? This is the first opposite, and this is the second one. So if you take the opposite of your number, you're going to get that number back, negative 3. Don't let that confuse you too much. We will go over those tomorrow. Thank you very much.